The prairie wind carried with it a silence that was never truly silent. Whispers of dry grass brushing against itself, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, and the faint thunder of hooves breaking through the desert haze. Out of the shimmering horizon came a solitary figure, cloaked in the dust of the frontier. His hat brim was pulled low, his face obscured by a mask that seemed to hold as many questions as answers. To those who caught even a fleeting glimpse, he was a specter of justice, a shadow that struck fear into desperadoes and stirred hope in the hearts of settlers. He was called many things: lawman, legend, outlaw, but the name that endured across campfires and taverns was the Lone Ranger. The tale of the Lone Ranger begins, as so many frontier stories do, with bloodshed. 6 Texas Rangers rode out on a mission to bring order to a corner of the wild borderlands. Instead, they rode into an ambush. The bullets cut through the silence of the canyon, and the Rangers fell one by one, their cries swallowed by dust and smoke. According to the legend, only one man survived, gravely wounded, left for dead, but not abandoned. A native warrior named Tonto found him, bound his wounds, and restored him to life. From that moment, the survivor swore an oath. He would ride not for gold nor for fame, but for justice. He would conceal his identity behind a mask so that no one man could claim the credit for what belonged to the spirit of law and order itself. But why did this story take hold so fiercely in the American imagination? To answer that, we must remember the world in which such legends were born. In the mid-19th century, the frontier was not a place of freedom as we sometimes imagine. It was a crucible of fear and survival. Towns were often little more than clusters of shacks and saloons, plagued by bandits who ruled the night with 6 guns and knives. Cattle herds stretched for miles, driven by cowboys who risked stampedes and raids for little more than a few dollars. On the trails, families carved their lives out of dust, their wagons creaking under the weight of hope and desperation. For them, law was distant, often corrupt, and rarely enough to keep evil at bay. It was in this world that the figure of the masked rider took root. America was a young nation then, its people longing for heroes who could embody both strength and moral certainty. The dime novels that circulated through camps and parlors were filled with tales of mysterious avengers and rugged scouts. They were not historical records. They were wish fulfillment, giving readers a figure to believe in when real lawmen often fell short. The mask of the Lone Ranger, whether born of fiction or fragments of truth, served as a symbol. The idea that someone, somewhere, could not be bought, could not be corrupted, and could not be killed by the same darkness that swallowed so many on the plains. And yet, as romantic as the story sounds, one cannot help but ask, who was behind that mask? Was there ever truly a man who rose from the ashes of ambush and pledged his life to a higher calling? Or was he stitched together from scraps of many men, drawn from history and imagination alike? This is where fact begins to blur with folklore. What we do know is that the idea of a lone survivor, bound to his Comanche companion, resonated in an era when survival itself often depended on fragile alliances and whispered promises. On a frontier divided by race, creed, and survival, the notion of brotherhood across such lines was both improbable and deeply powerful. It is no accident that the legend begins with betrayal, the ambush of men sworn to uphold the law. For the frontier itself was a landscape of betrayal, treaties signed and broken, families uprooted, promises discarded in the dust. The Lone Ranger, rising from this carnage, became more than just a gunfighter. He was redemption itself. His silver bullets were said to be crafted as reminders of the value of life, that each shot fired must be weighed, never wasted. His mask was not a disguise of shame, but a declaration that justice was not the property of a single man, but an eternal ideal. Still, the West was never as clear-cut as the tales made it seem. Behind every campfire story lay the reality of sweat, blood, and hunger. Yet even in that reality, people clung to the hope that a masked rider might be out there, galloping through the dust, standing between the innocent and the lawless. Perhaps that is why, long before he appeared on radios and television screens, the legend of the Lone Ranger was already alive in the hearts of those who dreamed of justice in a world where it was so often absent. The question remains, was this masked figure the invention of imagination alone, Or was he drawn from the shadows of real men, whose courage and sacrifice would one day give flesh to the phantom rider of the plains? The story of the Lone Ranger cannot be told without first stepping into the boots of the men whose name he carried, the Texas Rangers. They were neither holy saints nor outright sinners, but something in between, products of their time, molded by the harshness of the frontier. The Rangers were born in the 1830s, in the uncertain days of Texas independence. There was no standing army to protect settlers from raids, no reliable sheriff to bring order to the prairies. So armed with muskets and grit, volunteers took to the saddle, calling themselves Rangers. Their task was clear: to defend the fragile settlements from Comanche raids, cattle thieves, and Mexican incursions. In truth, they were little more than militia in the beginning, but the name stuck, and soon the Rangers became a permanent force on the Texas landscape. By the time the Lone Ranger legend was said to have unfolded in the mid-1800s, the Rangers had grown in reputation. They were famed for their toughness, their ability to ride for days across waterless plains, and their ferocity in combat. But their reputation was complicated. To many settlers, they were heroes protecting families from violence. To many native peoples and Mexicans, they were seen as brutal, agents of expansion, who enforced their brand of justice with gunfire and blood. Even in their own ranks, Rangers often walked a line between lawful duty and vigilantism. They were men who could enforce order one moment and cross into lawlessness the next. One story often connected with the Lone Ranger's supposed origin is the ambush of a ranger company. In 1873, 6 Rangers rode into the desolate hills of Texas, only to be betrayed and massacred by outlaws who had laid a careful trap. The canyon echoed with gunfire, and when the smoke cleared, only one Ranger was left alive. He would become known as John R. Hughes, a man who would later track down each of the killers, delivering justice with relentless precision. This massacre, and Hughes's vengeance, mirrors the legendary tale of the ambushed company from which the Lone Ranger emerged. It is no coincidence that Hughes himself became known as the Lone Ranger of the Rio Grande. Masks, too, were not alien to the frontier. Bandits wore them to conceal their faces during train robberies. Vigilantes used them when taking justice into their own hands, wishing to act without the stain of recognition. But in the Lone Ranger's tale, the mask was transformed into something noble. It was no longer a mark of criminality, but of sacrifice. The man who wore it renounced his personal identity so that justice itself could ride untainted. It was a powerful inversion of the symbol, and it captured imaginations in a way that outlaws' masks never could. The Rangers also fought in conflicts that blurred the lines of morality. In their campaigns against the Comanches, for example, they faced warriors who had dominated the plains for generations. The Comanches were fierce, skilled riders who fought to preserve their way of life against relentless expansion. Battles between Rangers and Comanches were often brutal, leaving trails of blood across the Texas frontier. Out of this violence grew a strange duality. Rangers relied on native scouts for survival, even as they fought bitter wars against them. This duality is echoed in the Lone Ranger's relationship with Tonto, his Comanche companion, a reminder of both conflict and kinship on the frontier. What made the Texas Rangers so enduring in memory was not just their victories, but their contradictions. They embodied both the savagery and the civilization of the West. They were protectors who sometimes became predators, champions of law who often ignored it themselves. And yet from their ranks and their legends, the seeds of the Lone Ranger were sown. For in their stories we find the very elements that shaped his myth: an ambush in the wilderness, a survivor who rose above vengeance, and a code that sought to redeem violence with justice. It is telling that the Lone Ranger is not remembered as just another gunfighter. Gunfighters were common enough. Names like Wild Bill Hickok, Billy the Kid, and John Wesley Hardin littered the headlines of the day. What set the Lone Ranger apart was not his skill with a revolver, but his commitment to something greater. Where many Rangers blurred law and outlaw, the masked man was imagined as incorruptible. Where many men wore masks to conceal shame, he wore his to elevate justice beyond the reach of corruption. The war for the frontier was never just about land or cattle. It was about the very soul of a young nation. The Texas Rangers were its soldiers, both feared and admired, and from their dust rose the phantom who would capture America's longing for a hero unsullied by the compromises of the real West. The Lone Ranger was a legend, yes, But legends are always born from truths, however harsh. And so the mask tightens and the figure grows clearer. Was he truly a man who rode alone? Or was he the reflection of men like Hughes, hardened by blood, softened by a sense of duty? In the smoke and shadow of the Rangers' wars, the legend of the masked rider begins to take form. Every legend worth remembering has its roots in flesh and blood men who walked the earth, carried burdens, and left behind footprints in dust. The Lone Ranger may never have been a single man, but two figures stand tall among those most often said to have inspired him: Bass Reeves and John R. Hughes. Their names are less known to the general public, yet their deeds echo with all the drama and conviction that one finds in the masked rider's tales. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838 in Arkansas. Fate, war, and sheer willpower carried him across the lines of bondage and into freedom. He would go on to become one of the first black U.S. deputy marshals west of the Mississippi, serving for more than 3 decades in Indian Territory. His record remains staggering. More than 3,000 arrests of outlaws, dozens of gunfights, and countless rides into dangerous country where few dared venture. Reeves became a master of disguises. He could pose as a tramp, a farmer, even an outlaw himself, all to trick fugitives into capture. His marksmanship was legendary, so steady and deadly that criminals whispered his name with fear. Yet what made him extraordinary was not his gun alone, but his character. He was deeply religious, carried a Bible into the saddlebag, and was known for a personal code of honor that mirrored the very values attributed to the Lone Ranger. He never drew his weapon unless forced, and though he lived in an age of hatred and violence, he upheld justice for all, regardless of color or creed. One tale tells of Reeves riding alone into a camp of desperadoes. Outnumbered, he strode in calmly, declaring their names, arrest warrants in hand. Stunned by his audacity, the men surrendered without a shot. Such was his authority, earned not by mask or myth, but by the steel of his will and the respect he commanded. Is it any wonder that historians see in him the clearest shadow of the Lone Ranger? A lawman who fought for order with silver courage, a man who could have worn the mask with honor. Then there was John R. Hughes, born in 1855, a man who lived long enough to see the myth of the Lone Ranger spread across the nation. Hughes's life began as a horse trader, but he would become one of the most formidable Texas Rangers in history. His story is inseparable from tragedy. When a band of his fellow Rangers was massacred in 1886, Hughes swore vengeance. For months he pursued the killers, tracking them with relentless determination across the wilds of Texas and Mexico. One by one he hunted them down, bringing the law's retribution upon their heads. His tenacity earned him not only the title of captain, but also the nickname, the Lone Ranger of the Rio Grande. Hughes was known for his discipline. Unlike many rangers of his day, he forbade drinking among his men while on duty, demanded professionalism, and earned the respect of governors and presidents alike. Theodore Roosevelt himself called Hughes one of the bravest men he had ever known. In Hughes, we see the outlines of the Lone Ranger's creed: a survivor of ambush, a man who turned grief into a higher calling, who stood as a symbol of justice on a frontier where chaos reigned. It is tempting to imagine that the Lone Ranger was born not from one man, but from the blending of these two legacies: Reeves' incorruptible honor and Hughes' relentless pursuit of justice. Together they form a composite picture: a rider who wore no badge of self-interest, who fought for the innocent, and who stood alone when the odds were impossible. But legends do not live on deeds alone. They thrive on the way stories are told and retold. Bass Reeves and John Hughes were remembered in newspapers, memoirs, and whispers on the frontier. Yet the mask, the silver bullets, the cry of "Hi-yo, silver!" these were the inventions of later storytellers who knew that truth, when polished with myth, shines brighter in the public imagination. And so, the shadows of these men stretched long across the American memory until they merged with the figure of the Lone Ranger. Whether Reeves galloping into Indian Territory with a warrant in hand, or Hughes chasing vengeance through the dust, the echoes of their courage gave shape to a legend larger than either could have imagined. The question that lingers is not whether the Lone Ranger was real, but whether men like Reeves and Hughes were greater than the myth itself. For sometimes history's true heroes are obscured by the very legends they inspire. By the time the 20th century rolled in, The frontier was fading into memory. The cattle drives were dwindling, the railroads had bound the continent, and the age of 6 guns and stagecoach robberies was giving way to automobiles and electricity. Yet even as the Old West receded into history, America's hunger for its stories only grew stronger. Legends of the frontier, half fact and half fancy, found fertile ground in the new mediums of mass entertainment. It was here, on the crackling airwaves of radio, that the Lone Ranger truly came to life. In 1933, during the dark days of the Great Depression, a Detroit radio station introduced a new adventure series. The nation was weary. Families gathered in dim living rooms around glowing radios, listening for escape from unemployment lines and dust storms. Out of those speakers rode a masked man on a white stallion, his theme music, Rossini's William Tell Overture, thundering like hoofbeats across the plains. From his very first "Hi-yo, Silver, away!" the Lone Ranger captured hearts. He was more than a character, he was hope itself, a reminder that justice could still triumph when the world seemed broken. The creators of the radio program set down strict rules for their hero. He would never drink, never smoke, never curse. Most importantly, he would never kill. In an age when dime novels and pulp magazines glorified violence, the Lone Ranger stood apart as a symbol of restraint and moral clarity. His silver bullets were not mere ammunition. They were emblems of preciousness, a lesson that life itself was not to be wasted. He was in essence a knight of the prairie, a figure parents could trust their children to admire. The partnership with Tonto was central, though it reflected both the prejudices and aspirations of the time. On radio and later television, Tonto was often portrayed as a loyal sidekick, speaking in broken English that reinforced stereotypes. Yet beneath the caricature lay a trace of historical truth. The real frontier had seen countless alliances between settlers and native scouts, partnerships born of survival, forged in the crucible of hostile landscapes and common enemies. The Lone Ranger and Tonto, though imperfectly drawn, embodied a longing for unity in a land too often divided by race and conquest. As the Lone Ranger's fame spread, the story leapt from radio to motion pictures, comic books, and in the 1950s to television. It was there, in the form of actor Clayton Moore, that the mask became an indelible part of American culture. Moore's strong jaw beneath the black mask, his clear moral voice, and his commanding presence on the white horse. Silver turned the Lone Ranger from a character into an icon. Week after week, children sat cross-legged before glowing screens, repeating his catchphrases and galloping imaginary horses across their living rooms. The West had come alive again, not in dusty trails but in suburban homes. Merchandise followed: toy pistols, silver bullet charms, lunchboxes, even Lone Ranger costumes. The Masked Man was no longer just a tale whispered around campfires. He had become a brand, woven into the fabric of American childhood. For many, the Lone Ranger was their first introduction to the mythology of the West, a sanitized yet stirring vision of good battling evil. He became less a reflection of history and more a mirror of the nation's ideals: fairness, courage, and unwavering virtue. Yet the cultural impact was more than child's play. The Lone Ranger helped shape the very way Americans remembered their frontier past. The messy realities of the Ranger's violence, the racial conflicts, the compromises of lawmen, all were polished away, replaced with a gleaming figure of incorruptible justice. The legend became a balm for national memory, allowing people to embrace the West not as it was, but as they wished it had been. Still, there is something telling about how eagerly people embrace this myth. In the midst of economic despair, war, and social upheaval, Americans clung to the idea that one man, with a steady hand and an unyielding code, could make a difference. The Lone Ranger was not just entertainment, he was reassurance. By the mid-20th century, his cry of "Hi-yo, Silver" was as familiar as the Pledge of Allegiance, a call to adventure that stirred both young and old. In many ways, the Lone Ranger bridged the gap between the frontier past and the modern superhero. Long before Batman donned his cowl or Superman flew across the sky, the Lone Ranger rode across the plains, teaching Americans that heroes might wear masks, but they stood for something larger than themselves. And so, as media carried his story into every household, the Lone Ranger was no longer simply a legend of the West. He had become a legend of America itself, etched into its collective conscience, a masked rider galloping not just through the prairies of Texas, but through the imagination of a nation that longed to believe in justice. The Lone Ranger's story is inseparable from his faithful companion, Tonto. For generations of audiences, the image of the two riders, one masked, one native, has been etched into the American imagination. Their bond suggested something rare, cooperation between cultures that so often found themselves at war. Yet when we peel back the layers of fiction, what emerges is a more complicated reflection of history, memory, and myth. On the frontier, alliances between settlers and native peoples were not uncommon, though they were often fragile. Scouts, translators, and guides played crucial roles in exploration and survival. Comanche, Apache, and Pawnee warriors sometimes rode beside rangers and soldiers, their knowledge of the land proving indispensable. But these alliances existed alongside betrayals and bloodshed. Treaties were broken, villages burned, and entire nations pushed westward under the crushing weight of expansion. In the midst of this tension, the idea of a white lawman and a native warrior riding side by side was both romantic and improbable. It was a vision of what could be rather than what often was. When Tonto was introduced in the 1930s radio program, he was meant to give the Lone Ranger someone to talk to, a narrative device as much as a character. His portrayal, however, reflected the prejudices of the era. Broken English, a one-dimensional loyalty, a figure too easily reduced to stereotype. Yet for many native listeners, Tonto's presence, flawed as it was, still carried significance. At a time when Native Americans were routinely vilified in popular westerns, here was a native character who was not the enemy, but the trusted ally. He was imperfect, yes, but he was a door cracked open in a wall of exclusion. The myth of the Lone Ranger thus straddled two worlds. It simplified history, yet hinted at truths beneath the surface. For every child who tied on a mask and galloped across the backyard, there lingered an image of unity. Two riders, different in blood, but bound by purpose. The legend glossed over the violence of colonization, but it also offered a vision of reconciliation, however naive. Memory works in much the same way. It remembers not always what was, but what ought to have been. And the Lone Ranger became not just a hero of the West, but a mirror of America's conscience. In him, people saw an idealized frontier, noble, just, hopeful. But in the gaps between history and legend, questions stir. Was justice truly so simple? Could one man stand above the corruption that entangled even the bravest lawman? Could a mask erase the darker truths of expansion, displacement, and survival? The legend endured precisely because it smoothed those jagged edges. Children did not hear about the scorched earth campaigns against native villages. They heard of a lawman and his Comanche friend galloping to the rescue. Families did not wrestle with the complexities of Bass Reeves's race in a segregated America. They found comfort in a masked rider who served all. The Lone Ranger was myth made palatable, memory refined into story. And yet myths matter. They shape how nations see themselves, how they imagine their past and their future. The Lone Ranger became less about Texas or the 1800s and more about America's longing for incorruptible justice. He was a cowboy knight, his silver bullets gleaming not in saloons but in the nation's imagination. Between myth and memory lies a paradox. The Lone Ranger never truly lived, but he remains alive in ways that matter more than fact. He is a dream of what the West might have been, a place where courage, honor, and unlikely friendship could outshine the cruelty of history. It is here, in this space between what was and what was dreamed, that the Lone Ranger rides still. As the dust of the Old West settled and the nation moved on into the modern age, the Lone Ranger remained. He rode out of the past and into living rooms, comic books, and movie screens, a figure who refused to be buried by history. But to understand why his mask still matters, we must look beyond the myth and ask what it was about this rider that Americans refused to let go. The Lone Ranger stood as a symbol of something eternal, hope in the face of lawlessness. His silver bullets gleamed with meaning, not merely weapons, but reminders that every shot, every decision carried weight. This was no reckless gunslinger, but a man whose code demanded restraint, justice, and mercy. In that sense, he became a bridge between the brutal realism of the frontier and the moral clarity of America's ideals. It is striking how the Lone Ranger foreshadowed the rise of the modern superhero. Long before Batman cloaked himself in shadows or Superman soared through the sky, there was a masked rider thundering across the plains, a man who stood apart, who concealed his identity not out of shame, but to embody an ideal greater than himself. His cry of "Hi-yo, Silver! Away!" was the anthem of a nation longing to believe in virtue untainted by greed or vengeance. He was the West's answer to a universal human yearning, the need for heroes. But heroes are never just about their times. They are about ours. When Americans in the 1930s tuned in to hear his adventures, they heard not just a story of a masked man. They heard a promise that justice could still prevail, even in an age of despair. When children in the 1950s donned his mask, they acted out a fantasy of courage in a world shadowed by Cold War fears. And when we look back today, we find in him a mirror of our own longings, our own doubts about whether one person can still make a difference. The Lone Ranger endures because he represents more than the frontier. He represents the best of what people want to believe about themselves. He was born from men like Bass Reeves and John Hughes, shaped by the contradictions of the Texas Rangers, and carried into legend by radio waves and television screens. Yet above all, he was carried by us, by our willingness to believe that behind the mask, behind the legend, there could be a truth worth holding on to. Was the Lone Ranger ever real? Perhaps not in the way the tales were told, but in the grit of Reeves's courage, in the steel of Hughes's justice, in the memory of Rangers who fell to ambush, and in the imaginations of millions of children who played at heroism in their backyards. He lived, and in some sense, he still does. Because every time we ask ourselves if one person can stand against lawlessness, every time we believe that courage can rise from the ashes of betrayal, every time we dare to hope for justice when the odds are impossible, the Lone Ranger rides again. And so we end where we began, a figure on horseback, silhouetted against the horizon, galloping into legend. A mask hiding his face but never his purpose. A rider of justice, whose true identity was never as important as the ideals he carried. The man may be lost to history, but the legacy of the masked rider endures. What do you think? Was the Lone Ranger simply a tale spun by storytellers? Or does he live on in all who take up the burden of justice in a lawless world?